Just popping on quickly to answer more of your burning sleep questions. Lindsay and a few others were asking about school-age children that struggle to fall asleep at bedtime, so I wanted to take a few minutes to address that today. If you have an older child that is struggling to fall asleep at bedtime, there could be a few reasons why that's happening, so I'd like to cover some of the common ones and then also share with you some of the tools that I found useful in addressing those issues. You may or may not know that I have a 7-year-old who is the reason that I help parents with sleep. He was very challenging, and while he's a great sleeper now, he's still a really challenging sleeper and a sensitive one. So we have found some tools in our house that have been really helpful for him, and I want to share those with you today. So the first thing I would think about if your child is struggling to fall asleep quickly and easily at bedtime is the timing of bedtime. So difficulty falling asleep can be triggered by either undertiredness or overtiredness. In most cases, it's an overtiredness issue, and it helps to know that your overtired child may not appear overtired, they may not be particularly acting overtired, and overtiredness could still be a factor. So often the two present very similarly. If your child's undertired, it might take them a really long time to fall asleep. They might be kind of bouncing off the walls, very anxious or very hyper. But also if they're overtired, that can manifest very similarly. We tend to think of an overtired child as very whiny and cranky and melting down. But a lot of kids that are overtired, even by a little bit, we're not talking about very large amounts. My son, for example, he is very, very hyper when he's overtired. He's almost like an extra version of himself, so he has lots of energy. He's super funny and super silly. To an outsider, they might think he's fine, he doesn't need to go to sleep at all, but I know that he's actually overtired. So just realize that overtiredness can be very deceptive. It can look like many different things, but it can still cause your child to kind of fight sleep or struggle to fall asleep even when they're trying and seem very wired. And the reason for that is when our child is up too late or has been awake too long, those two things being similar but different from each other, the body, regardless of how they seem on the outside, on the inside, the body kind of says to itself, oh, whoa, I've been up too long, or it's getting a little too late. And again, we can be talking about tiny differences in timing, maybe 10 or 15 minutes past whatever's ideal for them. And in response to that feeling, the body releases a host of hormones. And those hormones are designed to kind of give your child a second wind. And once that hormone release has happened, they're much more likely to have trouble falling asleep and hence to give you trouble when you're trying to put them down for sleep. So I would take a peek at your timing and maybe ask yourself, is it possible that your school-age child is either under or over tired? Just to emphasize that point about talking about little bits of difference in timing, again, to use my son as an example, he's very sensitive, which means it's very unforgiving, which means that if we do bedtime just 10 or 15 minutes differently than usual, we'll get a completely different experience at bedtime and overnight and in terms of his wake time the next morning. So for example, when he was 6 years old, he needed to be asleep by 8 o'clock on the dot, not any minutes later. He needed to get about 11 and a half hours of sleep, and he would always wake by 7 or 7:30. So in order for him to get that appropriate total of sleep, he had to be out by 8 o'clock. So that's one great way to calculate an ideal bedtime for your school-age child, is to figure out how many hours of sleep they need. You might figure that out by just taking the average of what they're getting. You might look to a resource like the National Sleep Foundation. Find out how many hours is appropriate for their age and count backwards from their natural wake time. And that will give you their ideal time to be asleep in the evening. If you do that and you discover that you've been starting your bedtime routine after that time, that's a really good example of where your child might be overtired by the time you're starting the routine, or growing overtired while you're in the midst of the routine. So to get back to my son as an example, he needed to be out by 8 on the dot. If we were able to make that happen, which is not always possible or realistic in everyday life, but when we could, we would have a great, easy bedtime experience. No tears, no rubber banding in and out of the room. He would sleep soundly through and wake at a reasonable time the next morning. However, if I had him asleep by 8:10 or 8:15, which is such a slight variation from 8 o'clock, I would feel like I nailed it close enough. His body did not agree. So when we were 10 or 15 minutes later than what was ideal for him, we would have a really difficult bedtime. It might be tearful. He might come to get me several times and I would have to walk him back. And on top of that, there was a greater likelihood that he would pop awake overnight, and also that he would wake too early the next morning and just get not enough total sleep, which would then just perpetuate the cycle the next night. So realize when we're talking about overtiredness, an overtired child will not always appear and act overtired. It can look like many things. And also realize that timing can make or break everything in terms of bedtime struggle, and that we might be talking for some very sensitive children about a slight variance in timing. On the flip side of that, as he got a little older, about age 7, I noticed that he was not falling asleep as quickly and easily at 8 o'clock, and then we had to make a tweak in the other direction. He was really ready to stay up till about 8:15. So now we have lights out at 8:15, and again, it's a very smooth process. So I tell you all that to emphasize the point that if you're having bedtime struggles, the first piece I would encourage you to really explore and think about and maybe experiment with is the timing of the bedtime routine, the timing of the lights out, because that can make or break everything. Hopefully that makes sense. The next point that I'd like to talk about with bedtime struggles for school-age kids is light and darkness. So obviously we are in summertime now. The days are much longer. We just had the longest day of the year. So your school-age child is going to notice that it is still light outside and that people are playing outside, as I see them doing right now. And that's probably going to cause them either to battle with you about having a later bedtime, or to just really have a hard time winding down at the end of the day because of the level of light. The hormone that helps us feel sleepy in the evening, melatonin, you're probably familiar with it. We start producing melatonin in response to darkness in the evening. So some kids just are not feeling sleepy because they're being exposed to sunlight for a longer period each day. What a lot of us as parents will do in response to that is just push bedtime later to account for the extra daylight. And some kids are going to be able to roll with that. Mine is not, and maybe you have one who is not as well. Most kids need their bedtime and they need to get their appropriate total hours of sleep regardless of the season. So if you fall into the trap of pushing bedtime later because of sunlight, again, your child may be overtired, that timing may be too late on the clock, and you're going to run into bedtime struggles. So if you recently shifted later, I would encourage you then to shift back to the timing where things were working more smoothly before. And if you need to, find a way to add extra darkness to their bedroom and maybe head up there a little earlier. Give them some extra time to wind down in that darker space so that they can be away from the sunlight and their body in response can start producing those sleep-helping hormones that will help them drift off at night. So timing and daylight and darkness is definitely something to think about. The next thing that I'd like to share with you are some tools that can be helpful for school-age children in addressing bedtime anxiety, general anxiety, and restless sleep. So, as with any products, it can be a miracle for some people and not so helpful for other people. But I do want to share the tools that have been kind of miraculous for us. One thing that it helps to know is that magnesium, the mineral magnesium, plays a really important role in sleep, how easy sleep is going to be to come by and how sound sleep is going to be. And most of us, even with a really healthy diet, and some of our kids probably don't have a really healthy diet, or they may be very picky eaters, even if you are a healthy, non-picky eater, you are bound to be a little deficient in magnesium, and it does play an important role in sleep. So some families, including ours, have had success with adding magnesium in any number of ways to see if it will help their child. We are fans of this magnesium oil. It's a roll-on product. Hopefully you can see this, much like deodorant. And you can put it on your child's shoulder blades or the soles of their feet. We do it right before bedtime. I really don't know how much is a placebo effect for my son or how much actually helped, but there is a lot of research to support that magnesium can play a really helpful role in restless sleep. So that's definitely something to look into. We got that on Amazon. I believe it's called Kid Safe. They also make a balm that's very easy to apply if you don't want the oil roll-on. That's one thing that's been very helpful for us. You can also try to add magnesium through diet, or speak to your pediatrician about some sort of other way to have your child's levels checked and get them some extra magnesium, but that's one easy way to do it. We're also big fans of the book series called What to Do When. This is a great book designed for kids age 6 to 12 called What to Do When You Dread Your Bed. There's also another book in the series entitled What to Do When You Worry Too Much. My son is a high anxious kid, so on top of sleep issues, we have anxiety issues to deal with as well. And both of those books have been really helpful for us to read together, to kind of explore and find ways to talk about his anxiety, talk about his sleep issues, and also kind of work together to troubleshoot, to make things easier, kind of be on the same team to fix sleep issues. So those books are designed to do along with your child and really help them understand what's going on in terms of sleep struggles and in terms of anxiety, and how you two can kind of team up and fix it together. We're big fans of those books. And then the final tool that I want to share with you is this album series by Lori Light. Her last name is Light, as in Lite. This is the Indigo Dreams CD that I play for my son every night at bedtime. We went through a period where he really struggled to let me say goodnight and step out of the room, and it was not an option for me to stay with him at bedtime. I am on the phone in the evening helping families who themselves are struggling with sleep, so it was very important that we maintain the process of saying goodnight, stepping out, and me going into my office. But he went through a period of separation anxiety and literally just didn't want to be alone in the room. So for us, putting on these stories was a really good compromise. The first night I listened to one of the stories with him, stayed the whole time, and then as he got used to the idea and started feeling comfortable listening to them, I would say, I'm just gonna, step out for a couple minutes, I'll be back to check on you. And now we've reached the point where we do our bedtime routine, I kiss him goodnight and turn his stories on, and I can step out of the room, and he can wind down and relax and drift off to sleep while he's hearing these soothing stories. The stories are designed to teach your child how to relax with breathing exercises and such, but to be honest, even if they're not following along, for some of them, just feeling like there's a voice in the room and hearing the soothing voice on the album is maybe going to be enough to distract them from whatever they're focusing on and really help them wind down at the end of the day. And the last track on that CD is just a background noise music track, so I would actually let him fall asleep with the stories on, then it would switch to the music track and he would be out by then, which was amazing. And now we play it every night. So hopefully you can look into some of those tools and they might be helpful for you. The last thing that I wanted to mention with school-age children that struggle to settle down at night is that in some cases there may be a sensory component. So in addition to my son's struggles, he also has some sensory issues, meaning he seeks extra sensory input. He's always jumping and bouncing off the walls and crashing into things in a very fun, playful, hyper way, but it can be challenging at times, particularly when it gets to bedtime. If he hasn't had enough sensory input throughout the day or leading up to bedtime, he's going to feel really antsy, really squirmy, and struggle to settle down. So not all children who struggle to fall asleep do have a sensory component, but it may be something to do a little reading on. You can just look up, sensory processing issues, or check out a sensory processing quiz and see if any of that rings true for your child. That's how I discovered that about my son. And for kids that do have sensory issues, sleep is a really common struggle, and they may need what is called a sensory diet, a really thorough way that you and your child know, a sort of a process that you go through to make sure that they are fed in terms of their sensory needs so that they're better able to wind down at the end of the night. Weighted blankets can help and things like that. So not to say that that is what's going on with your child, but just to sort of put out there that if you really can't figure out what's going on and your child's really, really antsy, despite adjusting the timing and the darkness and adding in some tools, you can certainly speak with your pediatrician. And if sensory issues are a factor, an occupational therapist is usually the person that would perform an evaluation and give you some strategies to use and some tools to make that aspect of things easier for you. So those are my thoughts on your school-age children and why they might struggle to fall asleep. Obviously, you are not alone. We have been through this too, and hopefully sharing some of the things that have helped myself and my son will be helpful to you as well. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if any of that is helpful. And if you have a burning question that you would like me to answer on Facebook, feel free to type it in the comments or post it on the page, and I'll be back to answer more of your burning questions soon. Thanks, guys.